you miss me? I've been out of a comatose, but the depression.
Hello, and welcome to Controlled Burns, the weekly hobbyless podcast hosted by me, SlowBurne from Wildfire Gaming. I got a fun new video game topic today, which is ranking the greatest video game launch titles of all time. I've been reading through some old issues of Game Informer over the last year, and recently read through the issues covering the launch of the Xbox 360, Wii, and PS3, which is what made me think of this. I also think by this time next year, there's an excellent chance we will have had our next round of launch titles with the success, or with the launch of the successor to the Nintendo Switch. So now seems as good a time as any to go into this. Before we go any further, I would just want to remind you that you can write into the podcast and have your comments or questions read on air at controlledburnes@gmail.com. Let me know if there are any other interesting lists you'd like me to tackle on the show. So, as I was thinking about video game launch titles this week, I came to the realization that there are two major metrics you can use when determining the best ones, which are quality and then impact or success. I think these two metrics are completely separate and unmixable, which is something that most outlets can't seem to understand, and it's a big reason I think so many video game lists are not very good. It's why you see games like Super Mario Bros. 3, for instance, in the top 10 of the greatest video games of all time, in our modern age, where if a game of that quality bar launched today, it wouldn't even crack the top 1,000 games of all time. So with this in mind, I decided to make three separate lists for this episode. First, I'm going to rank all the major launch titles that I think were important in terms of impact and success, and that pushed people to buy the new consoles and went on to have a big impact on the overall industry. This is going to be the biggest list of the three because it's taking all of gaming history since the original Nintendo console into account. The other two lists are more personal to me, and they're going to be factoring in the launch titles that were the most important to me in terms of getting me to want to buy a new console. And then finally, I'm going to rank all of the launch titles that I have completed purely in terms of how good I think they are, and consequential of the fact that they are launch titles. So to start things off, let's go into what I think are the most impactful and important games, launch titles of all time. I've got about 50 here. We're actually going to start with number 48. Um, and we're going to be going through what I think are all of the significant launch titles that we've seen throughout history. Number 48 is Earthworm Jim for the Game Boy Advance. I doubt too many people decided to buy a Game Boy Advance just because they could play Earthworm Jim, which is a classic action platformer from the SNES Genesis era. But at the same time, I bet that number wasn't zero. Earthworm Jim was pretty beloved by kids of this era. I know because I grew up in the 90s and I had one friend in particular, David Mendez, that was still talking about this game well into the PS1 and maybe even PS2 era of gaming. I also personally did buy and finish this port of Earthworm Jim on the Game Boy Advance. It's not great, but I didn't know that when I picked it up, and I bet a lot of other people didn't either, especially considering how sparse the overall launch of the Game Boy Advance was in terms of quality Nintendo product, which is quite rare for Nintendo console launch, as we're going to see later on. Number 47, I have Condemned Criminal Origins for the Xbox 360. This is one that I probably wish was bigger than it ultimately probably was, but I've always had a soft spot for Condemned because it was the cover story for the first issue of Game Informer I ever read, which was the March 2005 issue that my grandfather gave me for a birthday present on my 11th birthday. I've never actually played Condemned, but it was a console exclusive title at launch for the 360, and in that week lineup, I bet there were a fair few that picked it up on launch day. Number 46 is Assassin's Creed 3 for the Wii U. And it's tough to gauge the importance of Wii U launch titles because it's one of the very few modern consoles I've never owned, the other being the Xbox 360, if you still consider that modern. I've also never played Assassin's Creed 3, but at the same time, it's a game that I definitely remember being marketed heavily at the time, maybe more than any other game of 2012, with God of War Ascension as the runner-up. And for it to be launching on the new Nintendo console, because it had only been out for a couple of weeks prior to its launch on Wii U, on PS3 and Xbox 360, that's nothing to sneeze at. Number 45, I have Rayman Origins for the PlayStation Vita. The Vita's launch is almost as hard to look back on as the Wii U's, in that it was also a failed console. So really none of the launch titles went super far in terms of generating success for the Vita. That said, Rayman Origins was a beloved platformer in its day, and for it to be there on launch day for the Vita, 3 months after it launched on the PS3 and Xbox 360, was impressive. It was definitely the biggest third-party get for Sony for the launch of the Vita, which actually had a stronger lineup than you'd think given the platform's failure. Number 44, I have Need for Speed Most Wanted for the Xbox 360. It's tough to say how many people bought a 360 for Most Wanted, but especially because it was also available on PS2 and Xbox. But I guarantee that a lot of people picked it up on launch day. The mid 2000s was when Need for Speed and street racing games were at the peak of their success, and Most Wanted was a follow-up to the hugely successful Need for Speed Underground 2. It definitely wasn't as big as that title, but for it to be there at the launch of the 360 was nothing to sneeze at. Number 33 is Marvel Ultimate Alliance for the PlayStation 3. This goes hand in hand with Most Wanted in that it was also available on next-gen consoles, but the popularity of Marvel, which was still nothing compared to its zenith in the lead up to Avengers Endgame, was significant, and the four-person co-op action in Ultimate Alliance made this a strong go-to for players with siblings or friends that were excited about the new generation. And let me tell you, that Game Informer staff was crazy for this thing. They named it the greatest comic book game of all time when it launched. Number 42 is Call of Duty 2 for the Xbox 360. If Call of Duty was anywhere near as popular in 2005 as it is now, this game would be a lot higher on the list. I mean, here's a mainline Call of Duty title developed by Infinity Ward, launching as a 100% console exclusive to Xbox, something that's unheard of today, even though Xbox owns the property. Unfortunately, World War II games were a dime a dozen in 2005, and while Call of Duty 2 was generally considered the best around at that time, a lot of players had probably had their fill with the genre by the launch of the 360. Number 41 is Zombie U for the Wii U. I don't have a ton to say about Zombie U. It's probably the game that I know the least about of everything here, but I know it must have had some impact because it's still a game I hear about today. I guess its modest popularity makes sense. While the Wii U launch was stacked with third-party titles, it was hurting for true console exclusives at launch outside of New Super Mario Bros. U, which didn't differentiate itself significantly from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. Zombie U also remains one of the few games left that remains trapped on the Wii U, which makes it something of a hidden cult classic today. Number 40 is Sackboy: A Big Adventure for the PS5. It's hard to say how many people picked up a PS5 just for Sackboy, but I do think it was an underrated piece of a very stacked lineup for the PS5. Yes, most of the PS5 launch titles were also available on PS4, but the PS5 was an extremely hot commodity when it launched, and for anyone with younger children or for families looking to game together, Sackboy was their best bet on launch day. Number 39 is The Pathless for PS5. While it isn't talked about a ton today, The Pathless was a pretty big launch title for the PS5 as a third-party console exclusive. Its mixture of Zelda puzzle solving and hang gliding with Shadow of the Colossus-esque giant slaying, albeit at a much faster pace, was novel, and the art style was fantastic. I definitely remember this being held up by some at the PS5's launch as a landmark release, particularly Kyle Hilliard from MinMax, who was responsible for getting that game in the outlet's top 10 games of 2020. No small feat considering how stacked that year was for video games. At number 38, I have Resogun for the PS4. It may seem a bit odd to put an obscure 2D bullet hell shooter on a list of significant launch titles for the PS4, but if you take a look at that lineup, you'll find early adopters were hard up for games to be excited about, which was extra tough when considering the PS3 was not carrying over to the new generation. So in that sparse lineup, Resogun looked pretty and was included in PS Plus at the launch of the console. So anyone jumping into the service had this game waiting for them as an almost de facto pack-in title. While not too many talk about Resogun today, the partnership between Sony and Housemarque also laid the groundwork for the landmark PS5 release for Returnal. At 37, I have Call of Duty Black Ops 2 for the Wii U. It's possible I may be overinflating Black Ops 2 on Wii U somewhat, given the apparent clash between Nintendo's typical audience and the Call of Duty faithful. But at the same time, here's one of the most successful and popular Call of Duty games ever, launching on a Nintendo console within a week of the game's launch on PS3 and Xbox 360. I have to imagine this thing did quite well with a pretty major subsection of the Wii U audience, or at the very least with parents buying the new console for their kids. Number 36, I have Super Mario Advance for the Game Boy Advance. I almost didn't include Super Mario Advance, considering it is nothing more than a remake of Super Mario Bros. 2, which is hardly one of the most popular titles in that series' venerated history. But at the same time, if you look at the launch lineup of the Game Boy Advance, you'll find that gamers were desperate for anything with Nintendo's stamp on it, and outside of an obscure F-Zero title, this was basically all they got. Even my brother, who hates Mario, has this game, so that's got to speak for something. Number 35 is Bugsnax for the PS5. It may seem odd to have Bugsnax this high up, but the game's oddly catchy theme song made it an absolute meme leading up to the launch of the PS5, and it was also the first PS5 game included in PS Plus, putting it in essentially the same category as Resogun on PS4, but with a much higher visibility thanks to its presence at the preceding PS5 showcase. This was also a pretty big hit with children. Cal Hilliard's daughter christened it the greatest game of all time upon completing it at the launch of the console. At number 34, I have F-Zero for the SNES. This is another one that was a bit of a sleeper, especially considering every Super Nintendo had the much higher profile Super Mario World packed in at launch. But for anyone looking for another game to supplement that, F-Zero was by far their best option, and its staying power is unquestionable. Even though F-Zero is far from Nintendo's biggest franchise, its platform at the launch of the SNES resulted in a new series for the company that still persists to this day through F-Zero 99 from as recently as last year. Number 33, I have Knack for the PS4. Knack may be considered a meme now, but it was no small part of the launch of the PS4. As noted earlier, PS4 buyers were hard up for content at launch, especially considering the lack of backward compatibility of their new console, and the fact that Knack had Mark Cerny, the legendary game maker that was also the lead architect of the console itself, behind it, made it a pretty high profile launch for the console. And while it's nothing to write home about today, Knack was a looker in its day, particularly with all those particles flying around the main character. Number 32, I have Super Monkey Ball for the GameCube. The GameCube's launch was pretty weak in the grand scheme of Nintendo launches, but considering they are the undisputed kings of console launches, it was still great compared to most. Case in point, the launch of this quirky little series that sees players bouncing a ball with a cute monkey inside through increasingly treacherous and zany mazes and death traps. I may have not bought Super Monkey Ball myself, but I sure as hell played it at the many places where GameCubes could be found in public, primarily dentist offices and barbershops. At number 31, I have Castlevania Circle of the Moon for the Game Boy Advance. It may not be the biggest game in the series, but there's no question Circle of the Moon was the best launch title available for the Game Boy Advance, so that gave it the platform to kick off a decade-long run of handheld classics for the Game Boy Advance and its successor, the DS. At number 30, I have Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series. While Cold War is far from the biggest Call of Duty game, I would argue it was the biggest Call of Duty launch title. It factored in heavily to Sony's marketing of the PS5 and was unquestionably the most successful launch title on both the PlayStation and Series S and X, last gen version or no. At number 25, I have Killzone Shadowfall for the PlayStation 4. While Shadowfall's status as a great game may be dubious, it was without question Sony's biggest first party release at the launch of the PS4 and was also used as its technical showpiece. And what a showpiece it was! This game looked absolutely stunning in 2013. I would go so far as to say it was the best looking game in console history up to that point. It may be a footnote in PlayStation history now, especially as Guerrilla has gone on to develop the much more successful Horizon series, but this was the game to get at the launch of the PS4, no doubt about it. At number 28, we have Skylanders Giants for the Wii U. Unless you were a kid growing up in the early 2010s, it's hard to understand how massive the Skylanders games were. I wasn't, but my brother-in-law was, and in a Nintendo exclusive household, this was a game that carried such weight that he, as a 17-year-old, still looks back extremely fondly on it today. While I grew up with the original Spyro series, this is what kids played in this era, and it was no doubt a centerpiece for the launch of the Wii U and its target audience. At number 27, I have Peter Jackson's King Kong for the Xbox 360. Yet another game that's hard to explain unless you were there. King Kong was right there with PS2's Shadow of the Colossus in 2005 as among the most technically impressive titles of the year. While it was available on previous hardware as well, this was the biggest showcase of the 360 launch, and it left an indelible impression on all who experienced it at that time. At number 26, I have Resistance Fall of Man for the PlayStation 3. Like the 360 and PS4, the PS3 launch was hard up for new and exciting games. In fact, it was even more hard up, which led to the perhaps unearned elevation of Resistance Fall of Man as the de facto it game for the launch of the console. It's unremarkable today in the glut of FPS titles that oversaturated that era, but Resistance was nonetheless critical to the launch of Sony's erstwhile console. After all, without this, what else were people going to buy with their $600 consoles at launch? Genji with its giant enemy crabs? I shudder to think. At number 25, I have Luminous for the PSP. It may be hard to grasp fully today, but having a solid puzzle game at launch was critical to the launch of many of the most successful handhelds. Luminous was no Tetris, but it was a graphically impressive and no less addicting puzzle game that stood out from the pack at the launch of the PSP, and it permanently lodged Next Wave's shine it into the craniums of all who experienced it. Number 24, I had Luigi's Mansion for the GameCube. Luigi's Mansion may be the black sheep of major Nintendo first party releases at the launch of a new console, not counting the disaster that was the 3DS's release slate of Pilot Wings Resort and Nintendogs and Cats. But it was still a technically impressive, unique, and appealing game to launch a new Nintendo console. It wasn't the mover Nintendo wanted it to be, but it did launch a sub-series that persists today with a group of fans that are absolutely devoted to it, and it was also a critically underrated contributor to Luigi's colorful personality that took him out of the shadow of his more famous sibling and into the hearts of players the world over. At number 23, I have Assassin's Creed Valhalla for the PS5 and Xbox Series. You can't overlook the popularity of Ubisoft's premier franchise, and for a massive new title that capitalized on everyone's overbearing obsession with Nordic fiction at the time of release, Valhalla was definitely in the right place at the right time. While the PS5's launch window was stacked, the Series S and X's comparatively anemic lineup made Valhalla the de facto launch title for the console, a position I'm sure Ubisoft was happy to accept. At number 22, I have New Super Mario Bros. U for the Wii U. New Super Mario Bros. U may not be the sexiest launch title ever, but the success of the sub-series of the Mario platformers cannot be denied. Without question, this was the Wii U game to get at launch for basically everyone the console was targeting, and pick it up they did. New Super Mario Bros. U is the third best-selling Wii U game of all time, with more than a third of the console's entire customer base picking up the title. At number 21, we have Astro's Playroom for the PlayStation 5. Realistically, there probably weren't too many people that bought a PS5 just for Astro's Playroom, but did this completely free pack-in, a virtual unheard of for Sony, filled to the brim with quality 3D platforming and joyful celebration of the history of PlayStation contribute to the success of the PS5 out of the gate? Without question. The game was even held up as one of the best overall games of 2020, perhaps the greatest year for gaming of all time. And the game's success set the stage for even more lauded Astrobot, which may just win Game of the Year for 2024. At number 20, I have Uncharted Golden Abyss for the Vita. While not all pull it off, all console manufacturers want their hardware to have an exclusive killer app to accompany their new hardware on launch day. For the PlayStation Vita, there is no question that Uncharted Golden Abyss was it. Essentially a full-fledged Uncharted game on the go, Golden Abyss was a technical marvel in 2012 and was no doubt the biggest contributor to whatever success the Vita was able to garner at launch. The console may have been a flop in the grand scheme of history, but Golden Abyss definitely set it off on the right foot. At number 19, I have Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag for the PS4 and Xbox One. It may seem odd putting Black Flag, which was also available for last gen hardware at launch, this high up the list, but Black Flag remains one of the most iconic and beloved titles in the series' venerated history, single-handedly responsible for the rise of open world seafaring that would be followed by other games in the series, as well as other major releases like Rare Sea of Thieves. For players looking to kick off their new collections on the new generation, which again was not backward compatible with their previous libraries. Black Flag was their best bet. Up at number 18, I have Demon Souls for the PS5. It may be a remake, but the hype was real for Demon Souls in the lead up to the launch of the PS5. It was a true console exclusive, which persists today. Demon Souls in 2020 enjoyed all of the pomp and circumstance generated by the Souls series that it itself spawned upon its original launch on the PS3 in 2009. It was a well-deserved victory lap for one of the most influential titles of the last 2 decades, and boy did it look stunning, remade by the master workers at Blue Point Games. At number 17, I have Need for Speed Underground's Rivals for the PSP. The launch of the PSP was a moment. With its chief competitor, the DS, that made it to the market first. There was and the DS was exciting. I mean, as history proved out, it was ultimately the better console as well. But the concept of having was essentially a PS2, which was the most successful video game console of all time, on the go, was a truly salivating prospect for kids like me growing up at the time of the PSP launch. And for us, Need for Speed Underground Rivals was the title that showed it was possible. While it lacked the open world of the PS2's Need for Speed Underground 2, it had pretty much everything else, including some of the same iconic licensed soundtrack, and it felt like the mark of a true sea change for the industry at the time. And while the game itself may be forgotten about today, looking at the popularity of powerful handheld consoles like the Switch and Steam Deck, it's hard to argue that that's exactly what this was. At number 16, I have Soul Calibur for the Dreamcast. While I have Soul Calibur this high on the list, it really has nothing to do with my own experience with the game or series, as I've never played a second of it. But in 1999, this was pretty much unquestionably the most graphically impressive home console game of the age, predating the PS2 by over a year. And while the Dreamcast itself was not a success, Soul Calibur as a series would become a mainstay of the fighting genre, with releases spanning the next decade plus. At number 15, I have Spider-Man Miles Morales for the PS5. I don't think Miles Morales gets the respect it deserves as a launch title, based purely on the fact that it was also available on the PS4. But here's the thing, the PlayStation faithful were definitely buying the game at Christmas 2020, and when the PS5 itself already had so many reasons to buy in, including the other major releases we discussed here, like Demon Souls, Sackboy, Bugsnax, and The Pathless, not to mention the crazy value that was the PlayStation Plus collection, coupled with the graphical tour de force on display alongside buttery smooth 60 FPS action, Miles Morales was the crown jewel on top of the PS5's launch. I'll never forget playing that title on my new console that holiday season, which was smartly reflected by Insomniac in the game itself. It's also a holiday season in Miles Morales during the story. It was a truly awesome experience and easily one of my favorite launch titles, coming from someone who has historically almost never bought a new console at launch. At number 14, I have Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt for the DS. This is definitely the hottest take on this list because Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt is basically nothing more than a playable tech demo. But at the same time, as a 10-year-old in 2004, when this was trotted out in every GameStop across the country, it was the most mind-blowing thing I had ever seen. Here's a full 3D Metroid game that looks comparable to the big console releases on GameCube, available on the go. It was genuinely amazing. And if it had that much of an impact on me, someone who had barely touched the Metroid series at that time. Imagine what it meant to actual fans of Metroid. Scoff if you want, but in the words of our venerated President Biden, this was a big fucking deal at the time. Number 13, Star Wars Rogue Leader for the GameCube. Now, I know the GameCube was not technically as powerful as the Xbox, but for a launch title to look as mind-blowingly good as Rogue Leader did at the launch of this console, I just have to insist that Rogue Leader proves my the point that I still hear to this day, which is just that GameCube games, when they were done right, they just look better than anything else that was releasing in that console generation, Xbox, PlayStation 2, whatever. And beyond its graphical sheen, here was a fully exclusive Star Wars game releasing the same year as a landmark film in the series, but that set itself apart by harkening to the original trilogy instead of the prequels at that time, which ensured it appealed to both kids that loved both trilogies, as well as older fans who were happy to buy an original trilogy game to stick it to George Lucas and his prequels. And I'm sure he really felt that one. I'm not sure Rogue Leader holds up as well today as some of its peers in terms of its gameplay, but as a showpiece and as a genuine exclusive system seller in 2002, it didn't get much bigger than Star Wars Rogue Leader. At number 12, I have Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo. And now we begin Nintendo's first party run of dominance for its launch titles. No one else even comes close, and for Super Mario World to not even crack the top 10 is genuinely impressive. That isn't to say Mario World wasn't absolutely integral to the launch of the SNES. Make no mistake, this game was massive, particularly as an incredibly generous pack-in to the console itself from Nintendo. But as big as it was, it's only a glimpse of what Nintendo is capable of at the launch of a new piece of hardware. At number 11, I have Super Mario Land for the Game Boy. Super Mario Land may seem like it pales in comparison to Super Mario World on paper, but if you go look up which one sold more, and then you can tell me which one was the biggest success. As fine-flowing as having Need for Speed Underground or Metroid Prime was to me as a kid, having those on the go, it's clear the concept of having a full 2D Mario game on the go in 1989 was even bigger for people. And while Super Mario Land may be viewed as kind of the black sheep of the 2D Mario series now, there's still those that look back on it with rose-tinted others and or glasses, and others like my Mario hating brother that I mentioned before that swear it by it as the best game in the series. So Super Mario Land was a huge deal at the launch of the Game Boy and was a big part of the success of that console. At number 10, and we're getting to the top 10 now, so these are all heavy hitters. Number 10, I have Duck Hunt for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Having Duck Hunt this high might seem odd for anyone younger than, say, 30, but consider how massive Wii Sports was. Now consider a similar experience 2 decades earlier, also as a pack-in to Nintendo's first major console, and you may start to understand the importance and impact of Duck Hunt. This is the first majorly successful game that broke ground outside of the typical controller interface. For those that are unfamiliar, it was like basically a light gun game where you would shoot ducks on the screen with a gun peripheral that you held in your hand, and then you would aim manually and you know, just shoot down the ducks. That's all there was to it. It was a simple game, but it really was breaking new ground in terms of breaking out of that typical controller interface, and it definitely led to entire families getting in on the duck blasting fun on CRTs across the nation. It may not have been as big as Wii Sports. But Duck Hunt was a true icon of its age and an enduring memory for anyone who grew up with an NES in their home. At number 9, I have Super Mario 64 DS. for the Nintendo DS. Super Mario 64 DS served a litany of important purposes when it launched alongside the DS in November 2004. For one, it was a bona fide Nintendo launch title and a lineup that sorely needed one. For another, it brought the magic of Super Mario 64, the game that brought 3D platforming and movement to the masses, to a handheld. Thirdly, it served as a critical touchstone for a younger generation of gamers, including myself, that missed the original launch of a Stone Cold classic to experience it for themselves in a similarly mind-blowing way. Super Mario 64 DS, it may be divisive among the purists out there because of its inclusion of other characters and particularly for the developer's decision to lock players in as Yoshi during the game's opening hours. But for its target audience, it was a magical moment that sold DSs by the millions during its first few months. At number eight, I have Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast. Like many of these entries, even this high on the list, Sonic Adventure is another you had to be there moment in gaming history. While most new players playing Sonic Adventure for the first time in 2024 would likely struggle to get much out of it, this thing was a graphical tour de force in 1999 at the launch of the Dreamcast, and unlike the no less impressive Soul Calibur, it was helmed by gaming's at the time second biggest mascot of the decade. While Sonic Adventure didn't have the impact that Super Mario 64 did 3 years prior, for Sega and Sonic fans, this was their biggest and final moment to shine before the Dreamcast came crashing down 2 years later in the wake of the PlayStation 2. At number seven, I have The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess for the Wii. While I don't think it gets the respect it deserves, until Breath of the Wild, Twilight Princess was the most successful Zelda game of all time, and much of that is linked to its status as a launch title for Nintendo's most successful home console prior to the release of the Nintendo Switch. While Wii Sports generated the buzz among casual gamers and their families, Twilight Princess was the title that legitimized the Wii. It was a full-fledged and in fact sprawling Zelda adventure that was complete with motion controls. It wrapped in the darker Lord of the Rings inspired tone that fans wanted when Nintendo released the Wind Waker, which led to kind of the pushback that game got. And not only was Twilight Princess successful, it was masterfully crafted, without question, the best launch title of all time up to the point of its release, and in my opinion, still one of the greatest games ever made. At number six, I have Tetris for the Game Boy. While Super Mario Land was massive, the true killer app of the Game Boy was none other than Tetris. This was essentially the introduction to one of the world's most famous games to millions of players and their families, and was kind of the ultimate on-the-go game 2 decades before the advent of the Apple App Store. So, like the Candy Crushes and the Angry Birds that would follow it, Tetris was a game that anyone could understand and enjoy within seconds. Up at number five, I have The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild for the Switch. The launch of the Switch was a magical moment in gaming history for Nintendo and its fans, but it would have been a disastrous flop without the might of Breath of the Wild behind it. Perhaps the most anticipated Zelda game of all time, Breath of the Wild marked a major sea change for the series and has influenced pretty much every open world that has come out since, including its own masterful sequel. And not only was the game incredible, a big part of the magic came from the hardware itself, with the ability to switch between the big screen and the Switch's portable 7-inch LCD. It was the true marriage of Nintendo's hardware that gamers had only dreamed of in generations past, fully realized and bolstered by one of the greatest games ever made, ready to go on day one. It's tough to get better than that. But we have four that I do have above it. Number four, Halo Combat Evolved for the Xbox. It's hard, maybe even impossible, to overstate the impact of Halo Combat Evolved. Other than perhaps the original Doom, no FPS has made a bigger impact on the industry. Literally every FPS that has come out since 2001, and let me tell you, that is a lot of games, were directly influenced by Halo, whether you're talking about recharging health, the inventory system, or perhaps most critically, Halo's, at the time, innovative dual stick control scheme. Halo would have been a game changer no matter what console it's on, but for it to be the killer app for the launch of an entirely new console for a completely new entrant in the console wars, just as Sega was dropping out, made it nothing short of an atomic bomb for the industry. Make no mistake about it, gaming was never the same after Halo. So up at number three, I have Wii Sports. So while virtually every game has been impacted by Halo, well, every FPS game has been impacted by Halo. Wii Sports' influence went beyond the typical gaming crowd to include everyone from your grandmother to your little sister. As simple as games come, Wii Sports is a shining example of Nintendo's brilliance and was the perfect showcase to instantly sell the company's groundbreaking motion sensing concept through gameplay rather than words. It was a game that anyone could understand and have fun with. And as a result, pretty much everyone did. Even now, if you brought it to your next family gathering, there's an excellent chance that it would be just as fun as it was 20 years ago, if not as earth-shaking now as it was then. Overall, I'm glad the more traditional controller interface won out over Nintendo's motion sensing juggernaut, but at the time of Wii Sports launch, this was as big as gaming got. At number two, I have Super Mario 64 for the Nintendo 64. While Halo influenced the course of an entire genre and Microsoft's entire trajectory in the gaming sphere, and Wii Sports, if for a brief moment in time, broadened the gaming audience to never before seen scale, Super Mario 64 influenced literally every 3D video game that has come out since. Not only was it the first major 3D platformer, it pioneered the use of the analog stick that is now standard on every gaming controller known to man. It was the first and still arguably best example of a classic character series from the 2D roots of gaming, making the jump to the new dimension. Not to mention, camera issues and wonky physics aside, Super Mario 64 was an absolutely brilliant game in 1996, and it remains, a fun game to play today. More than that, though, it remains firmly entrenched in the hearts of all who experienced it at its peak. And with that, our number one most important launch game of all time, not the best. Again, we're going to go back into that here in a minute. But the number one most important launch title of all time, I've got to give it to Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo Entertainment System. What's the only thing bigger than bringing gaming into a new dimension? How about saving gaming, period? That's exactly what Super Mario Bros. Did in 1985 when the NES launched in the United States, a market that had been so oversaturated with bad home console games, they had given up on the quote unquote fad entirely. But Super Mario Bros. Proved that the US market wasn't done with video games as a whole, it just wanted good ones. And after kids got their hands on Super Mario Bros., the video game craze came back bigger and more widespread than ever. It's impossible to say whether the video game industry would be what it is without Super Mario Bros., but regardless, it isn't a stretch to say that our current industry owes a great debt to this landmark title. And that's why Super Mario Bros. Gets my vote for the number one most important launch title of all time. So there you have it. Those are the big list of the launch titles in terms of their importance and success. So now we're gonna get into some more personal lists, starting with it's a top 10, but I've got a couple of honorable mentions here of the games that were the most critical in getting me personally to buy into a new console. It doesn't have to necessarily be at launch, although it gets bonus points if it got me to buy a console immediately. But it's still like whether it was I bought it immediately or got it a few months after the fact. These are the games that were really pushed me to want these new consoles. And so yeah, like I said, I've got a few honorable mentions before I get into the top 10. And before I get into the games that I would say are honorable mentions, I want to start with the PlayStation Plus collection, which obviously isn't a game, but was more of a perk for those that were early adopters of the PS5. It honestly might have been the single biggest reason I bought a PS5, alongside some of the individual titles that do crack my top 10 that I'll be discussing shortly. The Plus collection was basically, like I said, a perk for PS Plus members that were early adopters of the PS5. It allowed them to immediately add 20 games. So, a typical week of PlayStation Plus, or month rather, of PlayStation Plus, you'll be able to add. At that time, it was really 2 games was the standard. Now the standard is 3. But at that time, um, you were able to add 20 all at once. Um, which it works the same way as PlayStation games claimed through PlayStation Plus Essential, which is that you claim them and then they're not yours forever, but they're yours. You have access to them anytime that you have your subscription active. So you can let your subscription lapse, whatever, that's fine. But as soon as you resubscribe, they'll be right there waiting for you. So that I do like that system better than the PlayStation Plus Extra and Premium or the Xbox Game Pass model, which is that they put games on there, but then they go away, and you never know exactly how much time you have to play them. When you claim them on PlayStation Plus, they're yours for as long as the PlayStation Plus service exists. So I do like that. And so to have 20 out of the gate at the for the launch of the PS5 was really kind of crazy, and these were major titles too. I wrote down the list of all the titles that were included through the PS Plus collection, and here they are: Batman: Arkham Knight, Battlefield 1, Bloodborne, Call of Duty Black Ops 3, Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, Days Gone, Detroit Become Human, Fallout 4, Final Fantasy 15, God of War 2018, Infamous Second Son, Monster Hunter World, Mortal Kombat 10, Persona 5, Ratchet and Clank 2016, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, The Last Guardian, The Last of Us Remastered, Uncharted 4 A Thief's End, and Until Dawn. So to have all of those available at launch was, I mean, it was incredible, quite frankly. And I still kind of marvel at it now. Now, I had purchased some of these already, obviously. Like these are some of the biggest games of the PlayStation 4 generation, but about half of them I did not have. And was able to claim through the PS Plus collection. So that was a really significant incentive for me and for other people to jump into PS5 from the get-go. And imagine if you didn't have a PS4. Imagine if the PS5 was your first PlayStation, as it was for say my brother-in-law Hank, who I mentioned earlier. Just being able to just automatically claim like pretty much all of the best games from the last generation, that was really something. And you know, you can't do it today. It only was around for the first couple of years of the PlayStation 5. So, yeah, if you get a PS5 today, you don't get the PlayStation Plus collection, but it was a hell of an incentive to get people to buy in early. And realistically, even though there's some games from the PS5 launch that are on my top 10 list, I think the PlayStation Plus collection was really the thing that made me buy in uh the most if I had to pick one thing. So that's why you know, it doesn't really work on any of these lists because it's not a game, an individual game. But I did want to mention it here because that was a big perk for in terms of enticing people to buy into the new console. So yeah, now I want to get to the honorable mentions before I get into my actual top 10. Number 12 is kind of a joke entry, but it is Fantavision for the PlayStation 2. Now, this was the first PlayStation 2 game I ever actually saw running in person because my uncle Gary was the first person I knew who actually had a PlayStation 2. He is not a gamer by any means, but I think what happened was he got it through some sort of like sweepstakes or drawing or something that his job. Somehow he ended up with a PlayStation 2 like at the launch of the console, which was crazy. And he had three games for it, which were NCAA 01, Madden 01, and Fantavision, which might have been a pack-in. I don't know. I have no idea why he had Fantavision. Now my cousin Brett and Brett was on a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the NFL. We had no idea how to play any of these games, even Fantavision. Like we could not wrap our head around how that game worked. But they sure looked pretty at the time, and it's definitely a very memorable game that I saw at the launch of the PlayStation 2. And I'm not sure that it really made me want to buy a PlayStation 2 so I could get Fantavision. And in fact, I have never purchased Fantavision myself, but it was a definitely a memorable thing, and I do get a kick out of the fact that Fantavision is now available on the PS4 and PS5 store. So one of these days, I might actually go through and actually play it, but it's definitely a very early, the earliest memory I have for the PlayStation 2 itself. So that's why it's an honorable mention. It's not realistically a game on the list. And number 11 is less of a joke, but also not quite worthy of being on the top 10. And that was Super Monkey Ball for the GameCube, which I mentioned earlier in terms of the most significant launch titles. This one is, you know, it doesn't crack the top 10 because again, I never actually bought Super Monkey Ball, even ones I got my GameCube, but it was the game that I often saw running on GameCube displays in offices like my dentist and the barbershop, like I mentioned earlier. And it was, you know, a colorful, fun, and easy to pick up and play game for those scenarios. So I think it probably did contribute to me wanting a GameCube, even though it did not translate into me actually buying the game. So that's why it's an honorable mention here. So now getting into the actual top 10. These are the 10 games that I think were the most effective at getting me to buy into new consoles. And number 10 is a sleeper. Number 10 is NFL Street 2 Unleashed for the PSP. Definitely an underground pick, but this was one of the first PSP games I picked up. And while I doubt there were too many others that were swayed by NFL Street 2 Unleashed, and I don't think that I bought a PSP for NFL Street 2 Unleashed, it was a really fun pick up and play sports title on the go, and I definitely got a lot of mileage out of it early on in my time with my PSP. It was a lot of fun to have, and I just have a lot of fun. I mean, I obviously haven't played it in almost 2 decades now at this point, but I have a lot of fun memories playing NFL Street 2 Unleashed on the go, like in the back of the car with my PSP. So, you know, it's definitely not getting higher than number 10, but I did want to mention it. Number nine, though, we're getting to the real heavy hitters already with number nine, which is The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. It ranks lower on this list for me because it didn't actually convince me to pick up a Switch right away. I was a later adopter. I didn't pick up the console until 2019, so like 2 years after it had already been on the market. That said, when I did finally make the purchase, obviously I wasn't walking out of that GameStop without Breath of the Wild. And it was the second game I played on the console. The first being Octopath Traveler, which frankly was the bigger system seller for me, but obviously not eligible for this list because it was not a launch title. But yeah, I think Octopath Traveler was the biggest reason that I bought a Switch. But then I did pick up Breath of the Wild as well, and those are the two games that I played first, and they're the two games that I have spent the most time with to this day on my Nintendo Switch. I want to I'll probably get into that maybe later in another podcast where I go through like my most played games. I think that would be an interesting idea, but and Breath of the Wild would be very high on that list without a doubt. So at number eight, we have Demon Souls for the PS5. Now, I've already mentioned the PS Plus collection. I had no shortage of reasons to pick up a PS5, but Demon Souls was definitely one of them. I didn't end up playing through the game when I bought it at launch, but I did play it a little. And I was like really blown away by the visuals of it. I still am, honestly. It's a really, really good looking game. And it's definitely a game that I still expect to get to, probably sooner rather than later. I definitely want to play through. Bloodborne is in my, we mentioned the whole episode on it last week. It is my number two game of all time. Elden Ring is in my top 25 games of all time. Those are the only two From Software games I've ever played. So I definitely am due for playthroughs of the rest of their series, like obviously all the Souls and Sekiro and of course Demon Souls. So yeah, it's definitely high on my list of games to play through, and I will play Demon Souls before I play through the Dark Souls games more than likely. But even though I didn't play through it all the way through or anywhere near all the way through it when I bought it, it was definitely made me feel pretty good about my PS5 purchase. It was certainly factored into, okay, if I buy a PS5 at launch, I'm gonna get the PS Plus collection, I'm gonna get Demon Souls and a couple other things I'm gonna mention on the list. So it definitely factored into the calculus of me deciding to pick up a PS5 on day one. And that was significant because I was a day one adopter of the PlayStation 5, and I don't know if I've ever actually bought another console on day one. There are other consoles that I would have bought on day one if I could, like the Wii. I couldn't get on day one because it was just so hard to get one. They were just, and PS5 was hard to get one too, but I actually got the email that PlayStation sent out some emails to like, if you want one, you can get one through us at PS Direct. Just get in line at this time, secure your console for a pre-order. That's what I did. And so, but it was a big decision for me to do that because I had never bought any other PlayStation at launch. PS3 I didn't buy until 2009 at the earliest because I have a Slim, and I don't remember exactly when I got that. PS2 I got pretty early, but it was probably 2001 or 2002 when I got mine. PS1 I got super late because it actually came out the year I was born, 1994, and I didn't pick up mine until like 2001. It was a gift. So PS2 was actually out when I got my PS1, but I don't even know if I was aware of that, frankly. I'm not. I was definitely not as plugged into the industry then as I am now. And then PS4 I didn't get until 2015, and the game that really got me to buy a PS4 was Fallout 4. So once Fallout 4 was announced, I knew I was gonna get a PS4, but obviously that was a couple years after PS4 had been out. So PS5 getting that at launch was a big deal. I'm trying to think if there were any other like Nintendo DS I got very early. It was a gift. And we're gonna talk about that in a minute. Wii I got as early as I could. But like Game Boy, definitely a late adopter on that, obviously. Game Boy Color I did get, but it wasn't like a day one purchase or anything. Game Boy Advance I got early, but it was not a day one purchase. Um, and then obviously I've never bought the Xboxes anywhere near launch. So yeah, the PS5 is really the only game that I have purchased with my own money at launch, and Demon Souls was no small part of that. We've already talked about the PlayStation Plus collection, talked about Demon Souls, and now at number seven, we're going to talk about Spider-Man Miles Morales. So unlike Demon Souls, I pretty much immediately played through Miles Morales as soon as my PS5 arrived. I already mentioned earlier when I was talking about the most important launch titles, how it was a memorable playthrough, especially once I realized how buttery smooth the game ran at 60 FPS, which is a rarity on a PS4 games. I actually started Miles Morales in quality mode instead of performance mode because I'd never had to switch or had the option to switch between them before. And then whenever my cousin Brett was like, "Hey, you got to try it on performance mode." I was like, "Whoa!" I thought it looked good already, but having it on performance mode and just how smooth it was, I was like, "Wow, this is a big deal." So that was definitely what sold me on. I'm always unless and it's a very specific case. I'm always team performance mode for sure. But like the other two games in the series, I knew Miles Morales was a day one buy. As soon as it was announced, I bought all three of the main line Spider-Man games on day one, and for it to coincide with the launch of a new console just made it that much more exciting. So, again, it was something I knew I could play on PS4, unlike Demon Souls, which was a PS5 exclusive. But because it was a part of what made me want to get a PS5, I was like, all right, it's gonna be awesome to be able to play that on my PS5 as soon as I get it. Number six for me is Need for Speed Underground Rivals on the PSP. I was a big fan of Need for Speed Underground 2 on PS2, so the thought of having something similar on the go really made Underground Rivals for sure my most wanted launch title for the PSP. It is the game, without a doubt, that made me want to get a PSP. And while the game did not have the open world of Underground 2, which did make it somewhat less enticing for me, it was still a very impressive handheld game for the time, and I got a lot of solid time in with it at launch. So, Need for Speed Underground Rivals, definitely a big part of why I got a PSP as early as I did. I didn't get it immediately at launch, but I wasn't I definitely, it was 2005 when I got my PSP. I was for sure an early adopter of PSP. So that was another one that Underground Rivals really carried a lot of weight on that one. On number five, I have Astro's Playroom for the PS5. So if there was any doubt I was picking up a PS5 at launch for the other reasons I've talked about, once Astro was announced, there was no doubt I was going to get it because I had always been interested in the Astro VR title, but I don't have PlayStation VR, so I'd never been able to play it. But I'd heard so many good things. I love 3D platformers. Those were the games that I grew up on. And then obviously PlayStation had been my go-to console since the PS1. So there really could not have been a game more geared toward me and my personal nostalgia than Astro's Playroom. So, it goes without saying, this was immediately what I loaded up the night I got my PS5 delivered, and it made for one hell of a fun night. I loved it. I still love it. I'm playing through Astro Bot now. I haven't had the time to get all the way through it yet. But yeah, Astro's Playroom, that was such a strong memory from the beginning of the PS5, and I adored it. Number five, huge reason why I wanted to get a PS5. So number four, we have The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess for the Wii. I had actually never played through a Zelda title in the lead up to the launch of Twilight Princess. But there was so much here for me to get excited about. The motion controls were extremely exciting for me at the time. It was also the first Zelda that was going to be rated teen, which as a 12-year-old, when it launched, that was about to be allowed to play teen games for the first time. That was really enticing. My mom was really strict. I think I've talked about this before. My mom was really strict about what games I could play. And so I was actually stuck with E for Everyone games for so long. And we didn't even have E10 games whenever I was a kid. Like, I think those came in like right around the time that I turned 13. But that I was about to be able to do that, so that was an exciting time. Then this new one was rated teen, and I was like, "Oh man, one of my first teen games is going to be this new Zelda game for my Wii that I can't wait to get." So all of that was together was very enticing. And then, of course, when we got our Wii's, we did buy Twilight Princess immediately. When I say we, I'm talking about me and my brother. I didn't get all the way through Twilight Princess right away. It was still maybe a little much for me in terms of my attention span when I was 13, but I still, even not getting through it, I was really blown away by the intro and just like everything that I did get through during the game. I thought was just like awesome. And it was certainly made for one hell of a launch title either way. So yeah, Twilight Princess, very strong number four on this list. Moving on now to number three, though, we have Super Mario 64 DS. This is actually the game that is currently on display in the highlight position in my Nintendo handheld cube shelf in my living room. My living room, I have some different various shelves that my wife and I split. She has her shelves that she has stuff to display on, and I have my stuff that I display. And I've got several of the cubes devoted to different video game consoles. I've got one that's devoted to like the Wii and the Switch put together, and I think the GameCube as well is mixed in there. I have one for Nintendo handheld, so that's like your Game Boy Advance and the DS and the 3DS. I have a PS4 shelf that also mixes in PS5. I have a PS2 shelf. I have a PS1 shelf. Um, And then yeah, and a PS3 shelf as well. And then I have like an Xbox shelf. And and then like the way I line them up is there's always one game that's like on display in each of the cubes. Like they're all I have like the ones that I like the most in the front because there's like two rows. But then there's also one that's like it's like facing out. You can see the entire front cover with the way I have it kind of lined in there as an accent. And for my handheld section, it is Super Mario 64 DS that is currently on display. A lot of that is just I love my history with this game. So I mentioned earlier that seeing Metroid Prime Hunters was a big deal for me in that earlier list. So after seeing that, um, in the lead up to the launch of the DS, this was holiday 2004. There was no console I wanted more. Um, well, I was getting one on Christmas. For Christmas, my grandparents had actually gone to the GameStop and bought three DSs, and they actually couldn't do that because they bought one for me, they got one for my cousin Brett, they got one for my brother Brandon, and they actually couldn't get three at once. They had to like go, and they had to like use this loophole where they would leave and then come back because Nintendo only allowed you to buy one at a time. Um, but yeah, there was no after seeing Metroid Prime Hunters, there was no console I wanted more. I think it was the most I'd ever wanted a console other than the PlayStation 1, which is my first, obviously, home console. Well, I was getting one. I didn't know that, but my grandparents had bought me one and they were going to give it to me on Christmas Day. But I didn't wake up at my grandparents' house. I woke up at my own house and then we were going to go to my grandparents' house later. That was typically our ritual on Christmas. Well, my parents kind of screwed up and they actually gave me Super Mario 64 DS, the game, before I was gifted my DS, which I got later that day. Well, you would think that that would have kind of clued me in that, oh, I'm getting a DS today. That's awesome. And again, I think the DS was probably the most excited I've ever been to get a Christmas gift. But it didn't. I did not connect the dots. I was just so excited to have the game itself, and I was like, man, someday when I get a DS, I am gonna play the hell out of this, and I was like so excited about it. And so yeah, then obviously later that day I did get a DS, and we were so excited. I hope someone recorded that because it's just like absolute gold of our reactions to it. But um, yeah, when I booted it up, it was basically everything I had dreamed. It was a fully fledged 3D platformer on the go, complete with a surprisingly addictive number of mini games as well. Those were a lot of fun. We got a lot of mileage out of those too. So and for me, it was all new stuff because I had never played. I mean, I had maybe dabbled in Super Mario 64. I know I had a friend that had Super Mario 64. I think I'd maybe played it once. And I thought it was awesome, but like, I didn't have I had a PlayStation, so um I had a PlayStation, so I obviously didn't have access to Super Mario 64. So it was all new to me. And I did not mind. I know some people kind of don't like that you have to start off with Yoshi, and you have to unlock Mario, and then obviously you can unlock Luigi and Wario as well. And I was so into that. I loved all those characters at the time, and starting as Yoshi was no problem for me. I was like, that just made exciting. It made unlocking those guys even more exciting. So yeah, it was so exciting. The launch of Super Mario 64 DS, and you know it it wasn't as important as that Metroid Prime First Hunters in terms of just like my initial reaction, but that was the game that I had and that I played in my first days with the DS, and it was just so special. So that's why it's number three on this list. Number two, I have Wii Sports. If you were there for Wii Sports, you get why it was so important. And if you weren't there for Wii Sports, it might be hard to get, but because it is a collection of five very simple mini games. But at the time, the thought of using those motion controls was just so exciting. It was like palpable. I'll never forget the day that my brother and I were finally able to get our Wii's, which were almost impossible to get for the first year that they were on the market just due to the demand. We like went to the local Walmart. For the first time we saw them in there. We were like, look, crap, there's Wii's in there. We actually didn't get them, and then we went back to my grandparents' house, and my stepdad was there, and he was like, "You guys saw Wii's and you didn't even get them?" He just was thought that was ridiculous. So then we went back and picked up two of them and came back and booted up, and we all played some Wii Sports, baby. It was awesome. We played it for. It was not a flash in the pan either. We played it consistently during those first couple years with the Wii. I even got into like the single player content, like that you could do, because they had like little single player things that you could do beyond like playing the main mini games with multiplayer. So, and it was all just because the motion controls were fun and novel, and that was what made the Wii Sports so awesome. So, um, yeah, it was definitely a special time, the launch of the Wii and having Wii Sports, and I was definitely swept up in that. So that's why Wii Sports is my number two, and my number one, the game that impacted me most, that made me most want to get a new console, is Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt on the DS. I know that might seem ridiculous, but like I said earlier, no game I've ever seen in a store blew my mind as much as Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt. I will never forget that shot of Samus like powering up or whatever the hell she's doing in that trailer. She's like she's like shining or whatever, and like she's getting her suit all ready to go, and then like she locks in, goes into first person mode, and then bam, you're kicking some alien ass. This is what made me want a DS more than I've ever wanted a system other than the PS1. um and even though the actual content that was included on the demo itself, which was included with every DS, was pretty sparse. You basically just play through like a tiny little piece of a level, and then you could do like some multiplayer, I think. But yeah, there was really not much to it at all. And then like you got to play a little. You unlocked like the trailer at the end, and you could watch it as much as you wanted. Um, but even though it was sparse, I did play through it multiple times and watch the trailer regularly. I would put it in my DS just so I could see it again. Um, like I just thought it was so cool. And what's weird is by the time Prime Hunters the game actually came out, because it was not a launch title, that it came out pretty soon after the launch of the DS. When the game itself finally came out, I didn't buy it. And then nearly finally, like 20 years later, last year, I did finally purchase it online during a Black Friday sale, I think at GameStop. And so now I do have it. I haven't actually fired it up, but I do plan on playing through it. I've mentioned, I think, on the show that I am currently playing through all the Zelda games. The only ones that I haven't played that are mainline releases are, obviously, I'm playing through Tears of the Kingdom, and then I'll have Echoes of Wisdom on the backside of that. But I plan to do the same thing with the Metroid series, where I play through all the Metroid games. So that's gonna be really fun, and that'll make for some good content on the show. But till then, yeah, Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt. That was the most that I've ever wanted. Now it's not like the most game of all time, because like of all time, it would probably be Spyro Year of the Dragon for the PS1 and Fallout 4 for the PS4. I think those are probably the two games that made me most want consoles like of all time. But those were not launch titles. Metro Prime Hunter's First Hunt was a launch title, came out with every DS. And so as far as launch titles go, Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt is the game that made me most want a new console. And it's gonna be I'm not saying that it can never be surpassed, but it would be tough because I'm not a kid anymore, and so like I can kind of wrap my head around things that come out now, but at the time I could barely even wrap my head around the fact that I was going to be able to play a fully 3D Metroid game in first person on the go. It was just so mind-blowing. So for that reason, it's number one on that list, and it's going to be tough to top. But okay, finally here, we've heard what I think are the 50 or so most important launch titles. We've heard the top 10 that were the most impactful to me personally. Now I'm going to rank the ones that I think were the actual best. So I can only rank the ones that I have beaten, or at least played enough to rank. And when I say that, I mean like if something like my number 18 is a game that you can't really beat, but if it's a game that you can beat, then I don't, or complete, then I don't rate it until I've done that. And if it's one that you can't, like a more arcadey game, then I just put some time into it, and then I can put a score on there. But yeah, number 18, we're starting with. So yeah, I got 18 here that launch titles that I have finished and can rate. So number 18 is the lowest, which I gave a 7 out of 10. So I'll give you the score that I gave each of them. But this is Columns for the Game Gear. It's definitely a sleeper pick. Columns is a classic Sega game that was included on a lot of its consoles, basically all of them. But it was a launch title for the Game Gear. Now, I haven't actually played it on a Game Gear. I've never held a Game Gear in my life. But I have played it on many of the Sega re-releases that have come out since then. So yeah, I gave it a 7 out of 10. It's a solid puzzler that I think it pales in comparison to its peers like Tetris and Luminous and Dr. Mario. But it still makes for a solid time, and it's got some good atmosphere. So, Columns number 18. Number 17, I have F-Zero for the Super Nintendo, which I also gave a 7. I was born in 1994, so obviously I didn't play F-Zero anywhere near when it launched. And in fact, I've never actually played a proper Super Nintendo, like on the original hardware. I think maybe I know I did have one friend that had a Super Nintendo, maybe even two friends that had Super Nintendo. So perhaps I played them and just don't really remember it. But yeah, I never owned a Super Nintendo. Nobody in my family ever owned a Super Nintendo. So it was definitely a console that I missed. But that said, I did blow through F-Zero on the SNES Classic when it came out in 2017, and I had a fun time with it. It seems odd that it was a big racing game that did not have multiplayer included. And obviously compared to racing games that are more modern, it definitely is nowhere near as dynamic as those. But it definitely, I think, is a much better game than the original Super Mario Kart that was available for the SNES. I understand why it wasn't as popular because it lacked the multiplayer, but in terms of just like, you know, just 1-to-1, you're playing by yourself, F-Zero destroys Super Mario Kart. So, number 17 on my list, I gotta give it a 7 out of 10. Number 16, which I've also given a 7 out of 10, Earthworm Jim for the Game Boy Advance. It's another one I missed on Genesis and SNES, but I did play all the way through it on Game Boy Advance after I picked it up. Like I mentioned earlier, one of my best friends, David Mendez, had it. I think he probably had it on SNES. He could have had it on Genesis. I'm not actually sure which one it was, but it was he was a huge fan of it. So being able to buy it on the Game Boy Advance and play it on the go, that was pretty exciting for me. But I kind of mentioned earlier, it's not really that great of a version. The game's biggest calling card and like the best thing about it is how strong the animation work is, and that is completely botched on the Game Boy Advance. So that's a shame. But the varied level design and gameplay design are still intact, and so that made for a fun time. I enjoyed playing through that on the Game Boy Advance. So number 15, which I gave a 7.25, is Super Mario Land for the Game Boy. Super Mario Land may not be anywhere near the best Mario game, but I will maintain that it is kind of the perfect handheld Mario game. It only has 12 levels, which I think is like the perfect length for a handheld Mario title. And while the graphics are extremely rudimentary, they do kind of have this unique charm to them, especially when you combine them with what I would argue is a great and memorable soundtrack. Um, that honestly I kind of like better than a lot of the more famous Mario soundtracks. I have a lot of fun memories playing through this game, kind of going back and forth with my brother because he actually has the original Super Mario Land cart for the Game Boy, which is pretty awesome. Um, and if I play it now, then I'll play it on my 3DS because I bought it on the eShop before the eShop closed. But yeah, I mean, I have beaten it legit, no save states or nothing on the original hardware. So that was really cool. And then also, I will say this doesn't factor into the score I gave it, but I'm kind of attached to it too because I love Game Informer's replay show, which they don't do anymore, but obviously because Game Informer no longer exists. But they would do this thing where every week they would play an old game on YouTube and it's for like an hour or so. And the episode they do of Super Mario Land is one of my favorites. So yeah, Super Mario Land number 15 on this list, 725. Number 14 goes hand in hand with Super Mario Land is Tetris for the Game Boy, and I gave that one a 7.5. As much as I have a soft spot for Super Mario Land, there really is no question that Tetris is the superior title, and it was the go-to Game Boy game at launch for millions of people. It's also kind of still viewed by some, particularly people who played it back then, as the definitive version of Tetris. And while it isn't my favorite, obviously for me, my favorite version of Tetris is Tetris Effect. It is hard to go wrong with the original Tetris. If you boot up the original Tetris, which again my brother has the original cartridge, which is very cool. Um, you're gonna have a good time. It's a fun game. So number 14. I don't think that Tetris is as good as people like you see it kind of held up today. It's another one like I mentioned Super Mario Bros. 3 earlier in the show where people hail it as one of the greatest games of all time. I think that's a little bit ridiculous. It's a block droppy game. Uh, it's the best one of those, but realistically, like in terms of how ambitious and grand in scope video games are as a medium, holding Tetris up to that level is ridiculous in my mind. But it is still a very fun game, and I don't think it's like a game that should be forgotten either. It's very good and fun, and anybody can enjoy it. It's just in terms of the greatest games of all time, it's nowhere near. But hey. It's a great game. Number 13 is Wii Sports, which I gave a 7.75. As much fun as Wii Sports is, realistically, it's nowhere near one of the greatest launch titles from a pure gameplay perspective. It did set the world on fire, obviously, and everyone and their grandmother was bowling, thinking they were the next Pete Weber. But you know, it's pretty rudimentary gameplay, realistically, and it's only got the five little mini games you can play. But at the same time, as rudimentary as it is, it's hard to deny a game that is capable of generating as much fun today as it did when it released, like almost 20 years ago. Limited as that fun may be, it does deserve some respect. I kind of like think of it as sort of like a Jackbox game, right? Like if you play a Jackbox game with your friends, yeah, it's not gonna be like the deepest experience of your life, but you're gonna have a good time, you know. So that's worth something. At number 12, I have Super Mario World, which I've given a 7.75, which is probably my most controversial take here. Super Mario World doesn't quite make my top 10 launch titles of the ones that I've played in terms of quality. Um, I do know that a lot of people love this game. I think a lot of the kind of, I would argue, undue praise that it gets is because of nostalgia, which I can understand. The games that I played through when I was a kid, like A Bug's Life and Spyro Year of the Dragon on the PS1, they're both very special to me. But the difference is I try to look at things a little bit more objectively and not get just completely wrapped up in rose-tinted glasses that are informed by my childhood not fully developed mind. And so yeah, I try to kind of split away from doing that. Super Mario World today is undeniably beautiful. It was a strong launch title for the SNES. But in my opinion, it just doesn't hold up as well as many of the more recent launch titles and games in general that have come out since. Games today, kind of like what I was mentioning with Tetris, games today are just much deeper and more complex, and generally, I would argue, better than they were in the early 90s, which I would say is a good thing. So I'm just not a believer in grading these older titles on a curve. We gave it its due for its impact as a launch title, but in terms of quality, there are plenty of other better experiences that you can have today, such as number 11. It was close between these two. Depending on the day, you can maybe get me to go back and forth on this. But for number 11 for right now, I'm putting Luminous PSP, which I've also given a 7.75. Despite its age, Luminous is actually the launch game I played the most recently. I experienced it earlier this year for the first time as part of PS Plus Premium. I gave it a little download because it was a game that I'd heard about for so long. I don't think the central mechanics are as strong or satisfying as Tetris or Dr. Mario, which I also find really satisfying. But the overall package kind of pushes it above some of the earlier releases of those. They've got the colorful music, or makes it colorful background, just like colors that they use in general, combined with the music, which I think is probably the most important part, kind of puts it above those early releases. And that's, I think it was all those elements put together that made it as big as it was, and obviously the most addictive launch title of the PSP. And it's also why the game has had the staying power it has had since. I know that there are still huge fans of Luminous, people that prefer Luminous to any of the other games in that kind of block droppy genre. And like those, it only takes a single run to understand the appeal of it, which I do think it's a credit to its design. So Luminous at number 11, 7.75 out of 10. At number 10, I have the original Super Mario Bros. For the NES, which I've given an 8. Unlike Super Mario World, I actually have played Super Mario Bros. On original NES hardware because my dad's second wife's grandmother actually still had her original console with Super Mario Bros. Ready to go. So the few times that I went over there and visited her, I was able to play it on its original hardware in its original form, which is really cool. In fact, I'm not sure I appreciated how cool that was at the time, but even as a kid, that was obviously exposed to much newer and overall superior experiences on the PS1 and PS2. I still managed to kind of get swept up in the magic of Super Mario Bros. The aesthetic, the soundscape, and then of course just the simple to play, hard to master gameplay. I mean, it is universally appealing, and that is the reason why Super Mario Bros. Was able to essentially save the U.S. gaming industry from ruin. So while I did have that experience playing Super Mario Bros. On the NES in those rare times, the most that I actually played the game as a kid was on the Game Boy Color Deluxe version, which was really cool. It took away, you didn't have as wide of a field of vision because the obviously the Nintendo or the Game Boy Color screen was much more condensed than a typical TV. Um, so that's kind of a bummer, but um, it kind of made up for that with the ability you can actually run backwards a little bit, which you couldn't do in the original. Like once you moved the screen, like you couldn't go back. And the Game Boy version, you couldn't go back forever, but you could go back a little, which was useful at times. And then more critically than that, you had the ability to save between levels. That was like really important. And then you could also play as Luigi, which was cool. And then you also had the ability to unlock like extra stuff. Like you could unlock extra challenges and modes. Like I know there was like this red coin mode where you had to hunt down the red coins that were hidden in the levels. That was cool. And then there was like this museum of Super Mario characters and enemies that you could, and maybe even games. I can't remember all that was in that museum. It's been a long time since I booted the game up, but I have actually gone back in. I do have my original cartridge, which is cool. I have a lot of nostalgia for that, but it doesn't really work very good. Cartridges don't hold up very well, sadly, compared to, discs and other more modern media. But I did buy it on the 3DS eShop, so I was really excited that I could do that, and so I do still have that version available to me to play, which is really cool. I think that version is probably still my favorite overall. But no matter what version of Super Mario Bros. You play, which is available on basically every Nintendo console that's ever existed since the NES, you're in for a fun time. I would argue, even in 2024. I actually like the game more than Super Mario World, even which I know is not a popular opinion at all. Super Mario World is obviously prettier, which I think goes a long way for some people. But I really like the simplicity of Super Mario Bros. It doesn't have like the pain in the ass like ghost houses where you're lost and don't know where to go, like puzzle crap. That's not what I'm interested in when I'm playing a Mario game. I just want to have fun platforming challenges. And I just think the design of Super Mario Bros. It's not by like a lot, but I do like it more than Super Mario World and Super Mario Bros. 3, which I like even less than Super Mario World. I really like the original Super Mario Bros. And obviously, you got to give it credit for its status. It's definitely undeniably the most important Mario game out of all those as well. So I don't really see why people don't give it like rank 3 and World above it when I don't think those games are better, and they're certainly not more important to the history of the industry than Super Mario Bros. So that reason, 8 out of 10, it's my number 10 on this list. Up at number 9, I have Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast, which I gave an 8.25. Now, I know that many today have trouble getting past the many faults. The game definitely has its faults that Sonic Adventure has. But I contend that if you can look past those faults, if you can get past the shortcomings of, the camera and maybe even the simplicity of the gameplay with some of the characters, I still maintain that you will find one of the most atmospheric and surprisingly deep action experiences of the late 90s. Um, I I get a kick out of Sonic Adventure even today. Now I will admit part of that is nostalgia. I did not play it on the Dreamcast, but I did play the re-release that came out shortly after, like a few years later on the GameCube. And this was still during my preteen years, maybe even like early teen years, where I was playing this with my brother in particular. Technically, it was his copy of the game. Um, and we had a lot of fun playing it. The story is generally simple. However, I think the ability to see it from a variety of viewpoints was a really novel concept at the time. And one of my favorite storytelling devices as well, still today. And that led to some great character moments. I mean, this isn't like Last of Us Part 2 level or anything, but you look at the tragic story of E102 Gamma, which I don't want to spoil anything here. Like, legitimately, I do not want to spoil anything here because I think it is a good story you should experience for yourself. But basically, Gamma is one of Dr. Robotnik's robots that goes rogue after learning the truth of its creation, which is very dark, surprisingly dark for a children's game. Like that stuff was awesome. And then like even like the Tails stuff, like seeing stuff from his perspective and like his hero worship and like borderline homoerotic love of Sonic is really cool. Then there's like all like the weird Master Emerald stuff with Knuckles, which gives you like a different perspective on Chaos, which is like the main antagonist of the game alongside Dr. Robotnik. There is a lot of cool stuff in that game, and I make no apology for it. Plus, like the music is so good, the atmosphere of it is great. God, I really have a lot of strong feelings for Sonic Adventure. I try to keep myself in check because I recognize that it's got some gameplay problems. It's definitely got some camera problems. But if you can look past that stuff, there's a lot of really cool stuff that game did. And then, not to mention, it had the advent of the Chow Guard as well, which it wasn't as deep or satisfying as the Sonic Adventure 2 version, but it was still a lot of fun, and it further increased the already quite strong variety that the game pulled off through the use of the different characters, like I mentioned. They all kind of have their own gameplay style, which um, is really to be lauded, I think. I've beaten the game with all of the characters at this point, even Big Cat. But I haven't actually unlocked the final. I know there's like a final run type thing that you can unlock. 'Cause I have done that in Sonic Adventure 2, where you fight like the fully powered up version of Chaos as he appears in the intro cutscene of the game. So I haven't actually done that. And so one of these days I definitely want to do that. I keep thinking Sega will at some point decide to, print money and re-release all the early 3D Sonic titles, Sonic Adventure, Sonic Adventure 2, maybe Sonic Heroes in there as well, in a single collection. But they haven't so far. And these companies sometimes they like to just leave piles of cash on the table. You got your Bethesda not re-releasing the early Fallout games, dumb. You got Nintendo not re-releasing like Wind Waker and Twilight Princess on Switch, dumb. You got Sony absolutely refusing to re-release Bloodborne in any form or even patch it, port it to the PS5 or the PC, dumb. So these companies are not the brightest. So I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that they haven't done that, but um, I either they'll do that someday and I'll play it there, or there is a version that I think I bought on the PS3, which at least has some trophies. I don't think it has a platinum trophy, but maybe I'll play through it that way. Again, it's been years since I played it, but gosh, there's just so much good stuff in there that I really respect it. So 825, number 9 on this list. Number 8 for me is a game that has not appeared on any of the other lists. That is NBA 2K7, which was a launch title for the PlayStation 3. I had given this game an 8.5 out of 10. This may feel like a weird pick considering it's just kind of a random basketball title, but for me, it is the quintessential NBA experience. The 2005, I grew up in the Dallas area, not in Dallas, but in the area surrounding Dallas, Northeast Texas. The 2005 and 2006 NBA season was huge in this area. It was where the Mavericks made it to the NBA Finals. They actually went up 3-0 in the finals against the Miami Heat. Then the Heat came back and won the final 4 games. The Mavericks crashed and burned, lost finals. That was very sad. But despite this was like the era where I was the most into basketball I've ever been. And I played a lot of games with my dad of NBA 2K7. Granted, on the PS2, I never actually played the PlayStation 3 version, but same game. So that's why I've included it here. And it actually got to the point where we played it so much that the PS2 disc, the inside of the disc, got worn out and like cracked for being inserted and removed from his console so many times because he had a PS2 Slim, so he didn't have the tray, which that didn't have that issue. Like I had a fat PS2 with the tray system, but he had a slim PS2, so it got like cracked and stuff. But yeah, that was man, that was a lot of fun playing that game. And even beyond those multiplayer experiences with my dad, I really enjoyed the single player mode that would allow you to draft your own players and create your own team. Well, you would pick a team, but then of course I picked the Dallas Mavericks. But then you would like draft your own roster and then take them through a regular season. Spent a lot of hours doing that as well. I never actually played through it enough to get through like a full season, but I have a lot of fun memories with that and just this game in general that I just can't help but put it here. And yeah, like I mentioned, I never actually played the PS3 version, but I did actually recently buy it at my local game exchange. So, maybe one of these days I'll fire that sucker up and see what I remember about how that game works. And throw down some jams. But yeah, that's number 8, NBA 2K7, 8.5. Number 7, I have Super Mario 64, which I've given an 8.75. I'm including both the N64 and DS version here because they're, realistically, they're mostly the same game. And I have played through both. Obviously, you heard how much this game meant to me as a kid. But realistically, as a game, like I think 8.75 is already on the higher end of what I can realistically give it. The DS version is definitely the one I've gotten the most enjoyment out of. since I was so blown away by it as a kid, like we talked about. There's actually the re-release of the N64 version that I played through when Super Mario 3D All Stars on the Switch launched, 3, 4 years ago at this point. And actually, that was the first time I actually got all the stars and 100% of the game. And it's the only time I've ever done that. So I think if I ever do that again, I will do the DS version instead, just to kind of shake things up and complete the extra challenges. But either way, no question that Super Mario 64 is a classic 3D platformer. It's not as smooth of an experience today as it was at the time, thanks to the camera issues, and I just do think the physics are a little bit wonky and the level design can be wonky at times. But it is still a lot of fun to play overall. Like if you pick up Super Mario 64, you will have a good time. So, yeah, number seven on my list, 875 out of 10. Number six, also with an 875 out of 10, I have Spider-Man Miles Morales for the PS5. The gap is pretty small between Super Mario 64 and Miles Morales, but overall, I've got to give it to this polish and storytelling that Miles Morales has. Going into this game, I really did not have a huge attachment to Miles Morales. He didn't do a whole lot for me in the 2018 Spider-Man game. And while I had seen Into the Spider-Verse at this point, it's hard to compete with Peter Parker, which is a character that I literally grew up for my entire life and that I've always kind of related to. But that said, I was really impressed by the more personal approach to the storytelling Insomniac took with Miles Morales. And in some ways, I think it actually is even better than the 2018 game because it doesn't have all those grindy random crimes that you have to go through to get the platinum trophy. I don't know that it quite it doesn't have the sense of scale that the 2018 game has. So maybe, and especially with the DLC, I probably still give the edge to the 2018 game overall. But regardless of which game of the series is your favorite, there's no question Miles Morales was one hell of a launch title, which we've explained why that was, and a very, very fun game to play at Holiday 2020. So number six on my list, 875 out of 10. Number five, I'm going with Astro's Playroom on the PS5, which I've given a 9 out of 10. As fun as Miles Morales was, it just couldn't match up to my love of Astro's Playroom. I mean, it's just such an effective one-two punch between the two of them for the launch of a console. But yeah, Astro's Playroom gets the edge. It may be short, but it's like joy to gameplay ratio, joy to time ratio. Like the amount of time that you have to play the game for experiencing joy is unmatched for me. I think maybe in the history of games. It certainly made me feel like a kid playing Spyro Year of the Dragon for the first time when I was, playing this game for the first time. 100%ing the game's four brilliantly designed levels. They're packed to the gills with fun references to experiences I've had throughout my life as a PlayStation fan. And then building out the collection in the PlayStation Labo only made the experience that much sweeter. I haven't quite had the time, like I mentioned earlier, to finish Astro Bot yet, but I am enjoying it a lot. But regardless of that, Astro's Playroom at the time was an absolutely magical experience for a longtime PlayStation fan to have at the start of the current generation. So for that reason, 9 out of 10, number five on this list. Number four, which this is a big jump because I'm giving it a 9.5 out of 10. Halo Combat Evolved for the Xbox. So as a primarily PlayStation player, I actually had an aversion to Halo for like the entirety of my adolescent life. While I did play it on occasion at a friend's house, particularly Matthew Fisher's house, I always got destroyed in multiplayer because I actually knew what they were doing. And I didn't really have any idea what was going on like the rare occasions that we played co-op. So I just wasn't interested. But when I finally sat down as an adult to play through the entire series with my brother in 2017, we went through all of the couch co-op games that we could, split screen co-op games, which is all of them through Halo 4. I was blown away by how much fun I found it to be. While Combat Evolved, I thought kind of paled in comparison to the other Bungie games for me during that first playthrough, because obviously the level design is very repetitive and confusing at times. I've played through it so many times since then that I've actually come to appreciate it nearly as much as those other games. Like it's up there with the Halo Reaches and Halo Reach is my favorite, then three, then two. All of those I would still put above one, but I don't think the gap between three, two, and one is big at all. I think they're all like really great games. It just has this perfect blend. Halo 1 in particular has this perfect blend of gun and enemy variety kind of wrapped in that 30 seconds of fun gameplay philosophy that Bungie's talked about. And it's across like this world design that while it's repetitive, they actually managed to really kind of insist a sense of place as you check from one side of the Halo to the other and back again over the course of the game, which I think none of the other games quite are able to match. Um, And it's kind of like what my brother said. My brother Brandon, he always says about Halo 1, there's just something about Halo 1. And he's right. It's just got great atmosphere, um, great balance, like I talked about. It's a very explosive game. Like there's just it seems like there's more grenades and they're always blowing up all over the place in Halo 1, and they can create chain reactions in Halo 1, which they can't really do in the other games. So that's part of it. I just never have a bad time playing that game, whether solo or co-op. And just the fact that it revolutionized FPS design on top of that, it's just kind of the cherry on top. So Halo Combat Evolved, 9.5 out of 10, number four on my favorite. All right, but I think they're the best launch titles of all time. Number three is a weird one. This is a game that I give it a 9.75. So about as high as it gets, like contender for top 25 of all time. It doesn't quite make my top 25, but it did at one point. It's Mass Effect 3 on the Wii U because it was a launch title for the Wii U. It was a launch title for any of the other consoles, but it was a launch title for the Wii U. It feels like a little bit of a cheat to have it here. Obviously, I've never played through Mass Effect 3 on the Wii U, played through it on the PS3, and then, of course, the PS5. And I would not really recommend playing it on the Wii U either because obviously that console lacks the ability to play through the first two games in the series, which is very necessary to get the most out of Mass Effect 3. That said, though, even if you did skip Mass Effect 1 and 2 and just played Mass Effect 3 on the Wii U, I'd have a hard time putting it any lower than number 3 on this list. The storytelling and character work is brilliant in Mass Effect 3. Again, not as strong as it would be if you played through the first two. But even without the first two, this is great characters, great set pieces, without question the best gameplay of the series. And so it really does make for still a very strong standalone experience. You're limiting the greatness of Mass Effect 3 if you play it on Wii U, but you're still guaranteed to have one hell of a good time if you do. So for that reason, Mass Effect 3, number 3 on my list, 9.75 out of 10. Number 2, also 9.75 out of 10, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess for the Wii. Until I played through Breath of the Wild last year, Twilight Princess was my favorite Zelda game. Um, Granted, it was the one I had the most nostalgia for, but I was also bought in from the beginning of its pre-release cycle. Um, which that's not really a but. That's just that's just part of why it is the most nostalgic Zelda game for me. But here's the but. I also think it genuinely was the best game in the series for many years for a number of reasons. Prior to Breath of the Wild, which admittedly changed everything, Twilight Princess had the best storytelling, it had the best atmosphere, it had the best combat, it had the best dungeon and puzzle design, and it was overall the longest and most satisfying Zelda game in the series up to that point. I know people swear by the GameCube version or the Wii U version because those don't have the motion controls. To be honest, I've always played through it on the Wii version, and as recently as last year, I played through it again when I was playing through those Zelda games. I still really like the motion controls. I think they do add something to the experience. I think they make the combat more visceral. I like the dynamics of how they do it. While I like Skyward Sword as well, I like that you don't have to be as precise on Twilight Princess with the motion controls, and I think that that actually makes it more fun. But then you have like the aiming and stuff with the bow, which is always a great time. I really love the Wii version of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. It is in my top 25 games of all time. It is one of my favorite games ever made. It's a masterpiece. Play it, play it, play it if you haven't played it. 9.75 out of 10, number 2 on this list. And then, obviously, by process of elimination, you can probably figure that number 1 on this list, which is the only one I've given a 10 out of 10, is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild for the Switch, which is in my top 10 games of all time. It's number 6 right now. And as I noted on my podcast talking about my top 25 games, Breath of the Wild was definitely a grower for me. The first time I played it in 2019, I found it too open and aimless. And I was playing without a guide. I was trying to really experience it on its own terms. I came back to it later in 2019 and was enjoying it more. But that playthrough was disrupted due to a major life-changing move where I moved from Texas to New Jersey, and I just kind of got lost in the shuffle with all that. So last year was when I finally tackled it front to back, did everything that you could do in the mainline game in the game other than I did not find all the Koroks, I will admit, but I got enough to where I could max out all my inventory stuff. So hundreds and hundreds of Koroks, all the shrines, all the quests. It took me like over 100 hours to do it all. Um, and I was blown away by it. uh, by then, after playing through all the other Zelda games, and I liked all of them to some degree. I expected to like the game, but I didn't think that it would be as high for me as it is for a lot of people, the people that actually played it in 2017. But in fact, the opposite happened, and I found myself perhaps even more impressed with it because I found that it did have the staying power to still absolutely capture my imagination as a grown man 6 years after it released. Um, it really is just like an amazing achievement. Even with a map, which I did use on Zelda Dungeon to help guide me and make sure I got everything, it is impossible to not explore and be amazed by your discoveries in Breath of the Wild. And I found that I enjoyed the more bite-sized puzzle approach of the shrines more than the kind of more in-depth experiences of the lengthier dungeons that the series popularized with other games. Um, Beyond all this, the game's atmosphere is, I think, second to none. And while it isn't an RPG in the traditional sense, and that you're not gaining levels, the pursuit of power that I felt playing through that game from beginning to end, going from the beginning where you're just a naked Link basically fighting stuff with sticks, to having like the fully upgraded Master Sword thanks to the Master Trials DLC, was awesome. It was almost Bloodborne-esque, the pursuit of power that I felt over the course of that game. Um, I'm currently very slowly making my way through Tears of the Kingdom, and I'm loving that as well. But it does say something that I still am nowhere near finishing that game over a year after I started it. Whereas with Breath of the Wild, I burned through that entire thing, 100 plus hours in like 3 months. And or maybe it's more like 4 months, but still, very impressive. It was just an unforgettable experience that I'm going to cherish for a lifetime. And unless something better can come along, I have to say it is easily the greatest launch title of all time. So there you go. Three different looks with different criteria of the greatest and most impactful launch titles of all time. It's been a fun experience looking back at these titles, and it makes me even more excited to see what the king of hardware launches, Nintendo, will have in store for us for the release of the next Switch, or whatever they call it, at some point next year. So thanks again for listening to this week's episode. And remember, if you want to write into the show or have suggestions for other fun lists that we can discuss, please write into ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com. Also, if you like the show, you can subscribe, follow, like, review, wherever you listen to your podcasts. I've got some big episodes with some fun guests lined up for the remainder of this year and the beginning of next year that I'm very excited to get to, so stay tuned for that. Until then, until next time, keep it warm.